Hello.
Hello all.
So we're here today to talk about Jin Jun Mei. It's a Chinese black tea that I think is very delicious and kind of has an interesting background and kind of is a nice entryway into the history of black tea in China.
And also like a nice introduction into modern tea.
Yes. It is
modern being a very relative term.
Yeah. It's a very new tea. It was invented in 2006. So we spend a lot of time talking about old tea. You know, tea has existed for thousands of years, and many of the teas that are famous are hundreds of years old. But this is not. And it speaks to kind of the modern sensibilities about tea a bit.
Yeah. And so tonight we're brewing this in a gaiwan, which is also like pretty good go-to brewing vessel for brewing black teas overall.
I will do a quick side note. If you hear skittering around or us looking off screen, our cat has the zoomies right now. She's being a little bit obnoxious. We'll try to make sure she's quiet, but cannot guarantee.
Deal with things.
Yeah. So this is a very easy to enjoy tea. Many black teas are very easy to enjoy, but this one in particular, I believe, is incredibly easy. It's sweet with a tiny hint of smoke. If you're coming from more of a English tea service, it could handle taking milk, but that's not how we usually prefer tea. And I also don't think it necessarily needs it. Milk will add sweetness that this tea already holds. Someone's saying it's very floral. Don't get that from other black teas. Yes. And there's a reason for that. This black tea is specifically made with the youngest growth of the plant, which is why it's also one of the more expensive black teas, because it takes like 1,000 or so buds to create a pound of this tea, basically. So there's a lot of plucking and harvesting involved just to make a small amount.
Yeah. It's what I find in the cup is we get this really nice like golden amber-ish liqueur.
Yeah, it's something white.
No.
There we go.
There we go. We'll figure this out eventually.
Yeah.
And it's in this cup. I get, as far as for like notes, is I get kind of like a nice caramely note to it, or like toasted sugars. There's a like undertone of pepperiness that balances that out nicely.
Yeah, I also get like almost like a sandalwood smoke.
Yeah.
Of like drying and kind of like an interesting, almost like, spice to it,
or like an incense.
Yeah.
Kind of. No. It is a very approachable tea. And it's black tea. It's an easy tea to drink a lot of, I find.
Yeah.
Now, which region of China is this tea from?
So this is from Tongmu Village, which is in Fujian province and part of the Wuyi mountain area. So there's a lot of history in just the location of this place or of this tea. The Wuyi Mountains produce a lot of famous teas, a lot of very delicious teas.
Yeah, that's where you'll get things like Daheng Pao through the Wuyi Mountains. Shuishan,
Lapsang Sushan.
Lapsang for a famous black tea. Yeah, a lot of oolongs out of that area, more than black teas.
Yeah. The Wui Mountains are very famous for their oolongs, and the theory is that the minerality of the rock mountains gets transferred into the tea, and I have seen that to ring fairly true of oolong teas made in the Wui region tend to have an interesting minerality to them.
Yeah, which I definitely pick up on in this black tea. And it's kind of mouthfeel. It's a little metallic.
It's like if you combined, like, or if you put like some kind of metal in a sparkling water almost.
Okay, yeah.
There's a little like almost bubbly sense.
Yeah.
I want to say on the tongue.
What it's also kind of interesting about this tea is you were talking about earlier today with me about it, that there's a relative amount of forgery with this tea, or that you'll get tea that is sold as this, but is not in fact Jin Jun Mei.
Well, and
what's that about?
That is complicated. Like in one aspect, there's a lot of forgery within the tea world. Once you have a very famous tea, other producers will try to mimic that tea, and some will try to steal the name for their tea, for that tea, and forge in that sense. There's also one thing that makes tea from Tongmu Village very expensive is that Tongmu, the area of the Wui Mountains that Tongmu Village is in, is protected by UNISEC. So there's very limited acreage available for the tea farms there. So that's another reason why this tea is very expensive. And then on top of that, to make things more complicated for this tea in particular, is that because of the limited acreage that Tongmu tea farmers have, they have outsourced some of their tea harvest and buy tea from neighboring provinces, and then finish the production of the tea in the village.
Oh, okay.
So like I can't guarantee that this leaf was grown as Tongmu, but it was processed at the very least in Tongmu and has that. So like there's a lot of layers to talking about forgery with this tea in particular, because there's tea that could be grown and fully produced in Tongmu. There's tea that could be not grown in Tongmu but produced in Tongmu, and then there's tea that could not be in Tongmu at all ever.
Yeah. And as far as like sourcing this tea on our end, locally wise, we were able to get it from our friend Matt at Little Tree Tea, which can be found online. Just search Little Tree Tea. .com.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned Little Tree Tea either last month or the month before. Matt does, before pandemic times, Matt did mostly tea tours and still had tea stock to sell locally. But obviously the tea tours have been put on hold. So he seems to be focusing a little bit more on tea product. And he has carried some of my favorite teas that we had in the shop as well. He has a really good eye for tea, and it's helpful that he's a smaller shop so he can be a little bit more discerning in which teas he chooses. He doesn't have to keep up
with the overall general trend of what's going.
Doesn't have to people please as much as some other shops have to do.
And so that's nice. I've also seen this tea, the Jin Jun Mei, offered online via a company called Yunnan Sourcing, which primarily is a better source for pu'ers, but has a really phenomenal range of teas. A little tricky of a website to navigate, but
think it's gotten a little bit easier over the last few years, but still a little tricky.
It's still stuck in the era of a message board type style layout of
yeah, you got to search the
websites.
tags kind of.
So it can get a little funky.
Yeah, Yunnan sourcing is a good source for tea. They carry a lot of really interesting teas as well.
Yeah, and so the way that we're choosing to brew this today is again Gaiwan, and we're using just off-boiled water, so about 95 degrees centigrade right now.
I did recommend this tea at closer to 85, and I think that's a little bit rings true to me, at least for my taste. I think it's a little bit sweeter at a lower temperature.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah. One thing that I found really interesting is the dry leaf. It's hard to see on screen, but for those who have this tea at home, the dry leaf is very powdery, and I'm not quite sure what that's about.
Like
it's a
dusty.
Yeah, it's like if you see there's like dust in the bowl, I don't think you'll be able to see, but there's there are remnants of like the hair of the tea that float off very easily, which I think mostly speaks to the youth of the tea product itself, of it being very young growth. But you don't see that level of dustiness in many teas. So I think that kind of makes it extra special.
Yeah. The leaf itself dry, I find has a very like chocolatey and like tangerine note to it.
Yeah. It's very representative of a modern black tea.
Yeah.
And it is kind of the parent of modern black tea, because it kind of helped reinvigorate the black tea economy, both internationally and domestically in China. So there's a lot of other newer teas or revamped teas that are kind of made in this style to have more of a chocolatey maltiness that older black teas don't always have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any thoughts for those watching about this tea? I know we got notes of floral that are unique to this tea. If you've enjoyed this tea before, how have you enjoyed it compared to other teas? How do the forgeries compare to the real thing in flavor? I don't think I've had a forgery, but typically they tend to be pretty close.
Yeah, I find it tends to be a duller flavor. So there's like a sharpness that exists here as far as like the level of the sweetness and the level of the caramelness is like punctuated. Where others that are mimicking this tea tend to be a bit more rounded and a bit more smoothed over.
It's definitely hard to pick up on whether or not you're drinking a forgery with most teas, unless you really know the tea that you're supposed to be drinking. And I think that speaks more to just the vast variety within teas, and like each harvest is going to be different. Each producer is going to have slight variation. So like a different batch of this Jin Jun Mei could be just very slightly different and could be a forgery or could be a real one.
Could be just a little off.
Yeah. It also does not have the tannin bite found in black teas.
Yeah, you can definitely see that, where it has a lack of that like general bitterness.
Yeah, the almost like dry bitter.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is This is why I think it's very easy tea. It's very enjoyable to drink because it doesn't have the potentially less enjoyable qualities that many other teas have. That is to say, though, that like teas that do have that bite are very enjoyable sometimes.
Yeah. What I'm finding now in our second infusion is going less caramely as far as the sweet notes and more of a mapliness, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it does tend to mellow out fairly quickly. I think the lifespan of this tea while brewing is a lot more similar to a green tea in that like probably 3 is its limit, 3 infusions, particularly as you get in a higher temperature or longer steep times.
Yeah.
It's a very delicate leaf.
Yeah, and that's very noticeable if you're looking at the dry leaf itself. It's a really short, twisted.
Yeah.
But I can get the camera to focus okay, which I seem to be.
Yeah, and then when you look at the brewed leaf, you can really see it as well. It's like this is like it's not fully open at this point, but it's still a very small leaf.
Yeah, especially when compared to all of the oolongs and everything that we've been lately, which tend to be pretty long, broad leaves. These are pretty short.
Yes.
Oh, it's really tasty. Now, we were talking about how this tea does okay with kind of bridging that gap between English tea service and more traditional tea service. Again, I could see where you could do milk with this. I wouldn't necessarily do that. But what I could definitely do with this, which I don't do with the vast majority of my teas, is eat something with it, like a scone or something like a little bit more of a treat.
It would go very well with a scone. Now I just want a scone.
Yeah, it's a tasty black tea, and I think as good kind of end of the year tea.
Yeah.
It's dark while it's also still being pretty vibrant. As far as a flavor profile, little amberish.
Yeah, I think it's both a good afternoon tea with these flavors and also a good tea for the kind of winter that we're having here in Vermont. I feel like it's a little too warm to be December. So this isn't a tea that you like will find immediate extreme comfort in the bitter cold necessarily. But it is very nice on a cooler autumn day or a warmer winter day of like, this is like a nice comforting tea.
Yeah. As far as storage of this tea, I find that it's definitely is good for like a long-term storage. Dark, dry space in a cupboard is probably good, and don't really start to have diminishing flavor effects for 3 months. Like you might get into the spring if you're able to not drink it all before then. Is kind of my problem with.
Like, I think it'll definitely show some diminishing returns a year in, but going through the year, it should be okay. This is definitely not a tea that I would age.
Yeah, no, I would drink this intentionally.
Yeah.
There are definitely some teas that I'll be like, okay, I'm going to put this on a shelf and not touch it for a long period of time. But this is one that I'd come back to every few weeks, every month.
I would want to finish this tea within 2 years of buying it, because after that, I don't think it would be very good. I think it would lose too much of its life.
Yeah. I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
I've had it for long enough around to find out.
Yeah.
But
I also tend to drink a lot of black tea. Black tea is one of my favorite categories. So I tend to move through it pretty quick, which I think most teas in the black tea category want to be moved through. Black and green tend to want to be moved through faster than the other categories. Yeah.
And so we've got this tea this month. What is our tea for next month?
Next month, we are comparing a Shou and a Sheng pu'er. So there will be 2 teas coming to those who receive tea. So that'll be fun. We haven't had pu'er in almost a year.
And winter's a good time for pu'er.
Yes, it is.
To sit down for long times and drink tea. So yeah, that'll be fun to start talking in again to those kind of balances between Shou and Sheng pu'er and what that really means, and how and or why they're different. And where you'll also get to see pu'er is a category of tea that we both very much like. We just like different pu'ers in those categories too. So that should be pretty fun to chat and drink with y'all. And drink tea in general. And trying to think if there's anything else happening over that. I think what we'll also like to try to do in that talk more so than in the periodical is talk more about different producers and different sellers of like how to source your tea, where to get it at, especially when looking at pu'ers, because as we went into in previous months iterations, pu'er has like a stock market type level of trade and purchasing. Where
pu'er is also where you see a lot more forgery. And then also there's a very new movement within pu'er that's like really changing the game in how pu'er is marketed and produced.
And what's trying to be sold versus anything else.
So like this month we talked about how black tea is always trying to reinvent itself. Pu'er is experiencing that for kind of the second time.
First in the like 90s.
Yes, the 70s to 90s. When during the creation of Shou pu'er.
The creation of Shou pu'er and also the banning of pu'er in the U.S. Until it was then let back in by Clinton.
And now we're seeing a second renaissance for pu'er in the most recent years. So
that
tea is always changing.
Get into and talk about. I think that about is wrapping it up for us tonight.
We're mostly through our 3rd infusion, and it's starting to noticeably lose some of its luster. And I think that means the conversation's coming to a close.
And we hope all you and yours are having a happy holiday and that you're able to share some good tea with them. Good conversation. We just wrapped up Hanukkah last week.
Last Monday
here, and we've got Christmas and Kwanzaa coming around the corner now. So
and the new year
and the solstice, entering the long dark. So as always, it's amazing having tea with you all and being able to chat and enjoy tea and conversation together, and we look forward to doing it again next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.